DEI is DOA, and the first 100 days of President Trump's second term are very much underway. Joining me today is Senior Vice President of CRC Advisors. It's Matt Whitlock. He is a crowd favorite. Welcome to Perino on Politics, where I call up my smart friends and I say, what is going on? Tell me about everything. Let's do big picture first, Matt. I decided this weekend to give up trying to keep up with everything that's happening in the first week of the Trump administration. It is incredible how much stuff is happening all at once, super organized, seems very professional. Like, you think about all those executive orders to get done in the way that they were, well written, well thought out. That doesn't mean there's not going to be challenges, but wow, there's a lot going on. How do you keep up?
It's amazing. I have to give them a lot of credit. This feels so different than 2017. I was in the Senate then, and I think the feelings, the vibes are just night and day different, in part because in 2017, I don't think we were nearly as unified. Part of it was, we had all the dials saying that there was like a 95% chance of Hillary winning, and then Trump came in and took it. And so it took time for people to get on the same page. They obviously passed the Trump tax cuts, but it wasn't close to this level of really kind of swagger that they're feeling. And they came in prepared. And when you look at the volume of executive orders, about 200 of them. Now, I think it's also important to note, I think 87 of those were undoing Biden executive orders on pretty crazy things like ending the White House Gender Policy Council, ending the Biden Commission to put pressure on the Supreme Court, things like revitalizing our commitment to environmental justice for all, things like that. But then there was also a lot of really important structural attack. You mentioned DEI in the intro here. The executive orders focused on DEI are really important because, as we know, DEI is really deeply entrenched in government. If you saw the coverage and feedback from when President Trump put out the order to fire or, release all the DEI officials throughout government, it was like you could feel footsteps of 10,000 people moving towards the doors. That kind of shows you how big and expansive that was within the government. But when I talk about this first week, to your point, there's so much going on that I look at really three key inflection points. One, the night of many executive orders. I think, again, conservatives don't always love a lot of executive orders, but President Biden came in with about 100 in his first 100 days. I think 94 of which had to do with the border. And so much of what President Trump is trying to do is, before our government convenes, set a level playing field by undoing some of the worst of what President Biden put in place, which were things like hamstringing our ability to build the wall, hamstringing our border patrol from being able to identify and remove people, and then things like DEI, which I think in a lot of ways conservatives see as kind of a Trojan horse that's been implanted that's going to take a long time to root out. What Trump did with executive orders is really set the table for a lot of that to happen. I think, the executive order night, it was really fun to watch. Those of you who know Will Scharf, he's the staff secretary, doesn't get a ton of attention, but he was the one who was handing the president the executive orders and explaining what they are. He became kind of a mini celebrity by the end of the week because there were multiple signing events. I saw people on Twitter calling him the executive order guy. He's a brilliant, brilliant lawyer who, has worked in different, government departments, worked in the Missouri Attorney General's office, just a really, really smart guy. And so when you look at people like Will and hundreds of others behind him who have been developing these ideas, these executive orders, but also the way that they flow into the cabinet departments, the way that they're going to work with Congress, you see how that preparation came to be. And this flurry of activity, it didn't come about by accident. President Trump brought in a lot of smart people. They started planning this well in advance, and we're seeing this executed. The second big inflection point that I would mention would be the immigration raids. This is something you and I have talked about quite a bit because they want to put a visual to what they're doing here. These deportation actions are overwhelmingly supported by the public. New York Times, not a conservative pollster at all, found that like close to 60% of people support deporting all illegal immigrants. But when you ask about people with a criminal record, 87% in the New York Times poll support deportations of any illegal immigrant with a criminal record. So what ICE is doing is saying, Bill Malugin, ride with us so we can put a face to what we're doing here. And when you see some of those really terrible people that they were arresting, you understand how important it is that they do this. But you also feel a lot of visceral frustration that President Biden let this go on for so long, that local leaders in some of these cities and states are saying, we need to fight to keep these people around because, they have a right to be here. They don't have a right to be here. And one of the
Or
other
that they
smart
would
things,
let them out of the jails in order to not work with ICE. And so they're just in and amongst the population?
well, and that to me is what's so crazy is, Bill Melugion's talking to some of these people who have been deported multiple times and brought back or released from prison multiple times. It's just horrific. And the White House put out a great thread last night of like the worst of the worst that they'd identified. There were pedophiles, murderers, people connected to ISIS. And it's just like these people were just in our neighborhoods because President Biden didn't want to take any action to get them out of there. I think that was crazy. And the last inflection point I would mention would be President Trump's California visit. I think that roundtable, I guess it was like a rectangular table discussion, I think really highlighted why President Trump won with a sort of unique coalition that he won with, because you had him sitting at one end and Karen Bass sitting at the other end. And President Trump is basically just saying, these people can't clean up their own homes. They can't even go on their properties and get their belongings.
Just for people who don't know, Karen Bass is the mayor of Los Angeles, and she was in Africa for the inauguration of the Ghanaian president at the time, even though there were emergency warnings about the fires.
Yes. And so President Trump said very clearly, why can't these people get started rebuilding their homes? And Karen Bass said, oh, they can. And President Trump said, no, your people are telling them it's going to take 18 months. And there were a lot of even like liberals on social media saying like, I'm with President Trump on this. Like, why can't we do it? And that's, I think, one thing that a lot of people find refreshing about President Trump is he doesn't understand a lot of this red tape. He says, do it, and we do it. It was very similar to what happened just yesterday with Colombia and these migrant flights that turned into a bigger conversation about, exports and tariffs. President Trump said, okay, take back your, criminal deportees or we're going to slap tariffs on you. And within about an hour, the president of Colombia is like, hold on, I will use my own plane to complete this if it can stop this, from happening. And so I think that it's cutting through nonsense is a big part of what.
Could we stick on that for one moment? Because you had a post on X that I loved in which you were talking to one of the prominent Democrats, I'll let you describe it, and that they still don't seem to understand why they lost in November and that the priorities of the country, at least the majority of the country, are not what they think they are.
I think it was so interesting to see almost like a bat signal went out to the left saying, this Colombia issue, we've got to highlight one, the cost of flowers for Valentine's Day is going to be terrible. And two, the cost of your coffee is going up. One, the fact that like every paid Biden social media influencer within a half an hour jumped on that message. And you had people like Anna Navarro from The View who were saying, oh, enjoy paying more for coffee. We know how strongly people feel about getting dangerous, violent criminals out of their streets. The idea that, people would be concerned about the price of flowers at Valentine's more than they would be concerned about the safety of their children in their neighborhoods, to me, just again, is a reminder, these people aren't really talking to any normal people. 87% of people support deporting anyone with a, any kind of criminal record at all. The idea that people will be like, oh, no, not the coffee prices. I just think that's so silly. Lowering prices is a huge, huge, huge priority to people. I would not downplay that. But if you were to poll and do a sort of, A/B test there, you're not going to find people who say, I'm really concerned about the cost of flowers so much that I want to stop the deportations and keep people like these multiple murderers, child rapist types who they have rounded up and are trying to deport here in our country.
Yeah. It was incredible. Before we take a break, I thought I would ask you about how DEI is not just a government issue, but has seeped into, of course, corporate America, but also tell me about like the medical community and the educators, because I know you work with a couple of those groups, just so that people understand how pervasive this was and how now maybe there's a way to claw it back.
Absolutely. I think this is such an important discussion because, as I mentioned, it acts like a Trojan horse in that it's been implanted in corporate America, in government, in local government. A group called Parents Defending Education did a giant study on this and found $1 billion in grants were given to schools. Another group called Do No Harm has done phenomenal work tracking not just DEI in government, but also DEI in the medical field, as you mentioned. The number of hospitals out there that are prioritizing things like racial quotas over things like performance. I would just point people to those resources. Parents Defending Education's studies on DEI funding for education. We have about 66% of the kids in our country can't read at their grade level. And yet the Biden administration was spending more than $1 billion to promote really, really divisive DEI policies that a lot of studies have shown us teach people to have more animosity towards each other than less. But then also in the medical community, this is one that I've seen a lot of really compelling polling where people are concerned that a hospital would prioritize someone's racial, gender, or sexual identity over their qualifications to be able to serve a patient and to be able to keep them alive. Let me give an example.
This is what I recall from one instance with Do No Harm that was brought to my attention. But if I get it wrong, you could maybe explain. So it was Johns Hopkins University had a job notice up. There was a job opening. And it was for a senior researcher type of person, a doctor. But it said in the I want to call it a classified ad, which I don't even know if that's what you call them anymore. But in the job posting, it said, if you're white, you need not apply. Yeah. And so there were somebody at Johns Hopkins saw this, alerted Do No Harm in an anonymous way, and then Do No Harm took a look at it. And as I understand it, they will call and say, do you want to take this down before we go public with this? Or they might even help you bring a lawsuit against it to try to help deal with it. So with an instance like that, given Trump's push on the government side of things and how corporate America is coming around, do you think the medical community and the education world will take notice as well and take their own measures without having to do anything more, at least in the courts?
I think more than anything, this is raising awareness of this issue in places and helping people understand these practices aren't okay. I think with the medical community, with Johns Hopkins, Do No Harm filed a federal complaint about that to HHS because in some form or another, so many hospitals are getting federal dollars for something, and you can't have federal dollars going to promote division, racism, things like that. And so Do No Harm has tons of resources out there to see this. But the other thing that they do so well is act as a vector for these complaints. Parents Defending Education does it in education. Groups like Consumers Research does it so effectively for corporate America, because even for corporate America, a lot of these practices that institutionalize racism will have legal complaints lodged against them. And you've seen so many companies like Target just last week came out and said, we're ending so many of these divisive DEI programs, in part because they know that if they don't do that, they're going to take backlash from their customers. And so I think that what we've seen from corporate America, a lot of it is a pressure system, but I think we're seeing it across the board where leaders are seeing the need to uproot this divisive tool. It's going to take a long time to do, and it's going to take a lot of involvement. A lot of state attorneys general are engaged on this, but it will be a process because it's now a part of the infrastructure of government that needs to be removed, because if it's not, the minute that the pendulum swings back and Democrats are in power again, they're going to be able to reactivate all of these really, really toxic tools to help them carry out their political agendas.
As a last question here, could you speak to somebody who understands this pretty well, I think, across the board, which is you had some Catholic leaders, Christian leaders lamenting the immigration raids, saying, isn't this against what we're for, which is the compassion and taking people in and helping them. I feel like it's pretty clear that there's a distinction between criminals who are living amongst us illegally. How do you see it?
I think that's so important. The worst first approach that the Trump administration is taking is really important here. They're focusing on the worst of the worst, and they're showing us exactly how bad these people are. And I think, J.D. Vance was asked about this. A lot of the Sunday show discussion yesterday was about deportations, with hosts saying, how can we do this? How can we actually accomplish this? And people like J.D. Vance and Tom Homan saying, this is what people voted for. And it's I think what JD has done well is reframe that to what about compassion
For
for
us.
people like Lake and Riley?
Yep.
Compassion for people that just want to be able to walk outside at night. There are studies that show that we have an all-time high of people who are afraid to walk around outside in their own neighborhoods. Things like this are a huge part of that. And so I would just flip that. The compassion needs to extend to people as well who want to be safe in their own neighborhoods. And again, this is not about, the Democrats will try and frame this as separating grandparents and, keeping children away from their parents. That's not the case here. We have 16,000 convicted sexual assailant illegal immigrants, more than 13,000 illegal immigrants who have been convicted of murder, over 1.5 million illegal immigrants who have deportation orders here. That is how you get to where 87% of the country supports this. And so you will see a divide between media and Democrats and where the general populace is. But again, I have to just go back to touch grass. I wish that CBS, before they did this interview with JD Vance, had sent somebody out with ICE to go around Boston and see who they were rounding up and see just how dangerous these people are.
Well, from a communication standpoint, I got to say the embedding of reporters from Bill Malugin of Fox News to Dr. Phil to others. I'm sure if CBS raised their hand and said, I'd love to come, that they would take them along too to show them.
In a second, because the value of it, you talked about this on the 5, and I thought you made such an important point. The image that defined the first Trump administration on immigration was this 4-year-old Honduran girl crying. We all remember it was the cover of Time magazine, and it wasn't for months until we found out that image was totally inaccurate. It was a girl whose mom was standing a few feet away. She had not been a part of a child separation policy. So the Trump team is going into this knowing we need to show our work here. We need to create visuals to help people understand exactly what we're doing so that it cannot be misrepresented. Remember Whipgate, Whipgate, where activists took an image of a Border Patrol agent using his reins on his horse and made it look like he was whipping migrants, that got 3 days of outraged news coverage before they clarified what it actually was. There won't be another Whipgate.
But even to this day, Biden never apologized to them.
Never apologized.
I so want to interview those guys, so I'm putting it out there. Let us manifest that here.